Hey there, students. It's Mr. Sharp here for our last video on Unit 1 colonization for our course in American History 1. So far we've talked a lot about mercantilism, the first few colonies made by English settlers, all the way to the establishment of the American colonies and the victims of colonization. Now we're going to be discussing in the last video of this unit how we start to shape our ideas leading up to the American Revolution because of the Enlightenment. So if you guys remember from ninth grade history, you talked about the Enlightenment, this idea or this period where people start to think about democratic ideas and scientific principles. The same thing is going to apply to the colonies, and this is what eventually leads up to the conflicts of the American Revolution. So with that said, let's go ahead and move forward. We're still thinking about our big idea of why do people move? Why do people move to the colonies? We already talked about voluntary examples of movement to the colonies and involuntary movements to the colonies. But now let's start to shift focus. Why do people move their ideas of governance and representation in the colonies? Why do people decide, hey, maybe it's a better idea for us to make our own decisions instead of somebody who's living 3,000 miles away in Great Britain to make decisions for us? So this is going to eventually lead up to our standard right here. What does it mean to obtain the American dream? So with that, I'm going to say bon voyage to my little man, and let's get forward. As you guys are following along in your notes, make sure you're capturing these big essential questions right here for the quiz coming up. Excuse me. And today we're going to be focusing mainly on the ideas of democracy and republicanism, how those were influenced in the colonies. How did the Great Awakening impact colonial ways of thinking of democracy and freedoms? And not only that, what are some of the events that really just tipped the colonists off from saying, yeah, I don't think listening to the Great Britain and their officials is such a good idea. So let's go ahead and move forward. Here are some of the key terms that we're going to be talking about today. You can pause this video to take a look and record. They are in your Quizlet study set, don't forget. So, as we start everything off, there's a lot of English history we can talk about here. However, there's going to be two important documentations that are part of English history that came about way before the establishment of the American colonies that will influence our ideas of what it means to have English common law. These documents are the Magna Carta, signed in 1215 to establish Parliament in Great Britain. In addition to that, the English Bill of Rights that come about through the Glorious Revolution after the overthrow of King James II and his ascension and the ascension of King William and Queen Mary to the throne of Great Britain to establish a Bill of Rights for individual freedoms for people, not just for the gentry, but for individual people. These are going to be those documentations that help influence American colonies to think there are ideas out there of how we can establish a representative style government, and there is an idea that every person under common law has equal rights. Of course, this time that's not going to relate to people who are coming from other countries of the world, especially not to West Africans coming, but people who are living in the colonies. And throughout American history, we can learn how those rights are eventually extended to everybody. So with that said, we already experimented a little bit in the colonies with representative style governments and documentations recording that with the House of Burgesses in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia. This was established to help have the colonies elect their own officials to make decisions at their level, and it would eventually become the General Assembly of Virginia. And also in Plymouth Colony, where you had the Mayflower Compact, where the settlers all signed the written agreement that they would abide by these laws in order to create a colony for their own. And by the time the 1700s roll around and all the colonies are established, every colony has their own assembly, their own general assembly to make legislative and local laws at their level. However, the king is still at the top, as well as Parliament below him or her. So they're still the head on top, but those colonial assemblies are really what help instill those ideas of self-government. And as we get into the late 1600s, 1700s, there are going to be different events that help shape our American way of thinking. For example, there was this idea called salutary neglect, and it was the idea that even though the king and parliament were still at the top, they would allow the colonies to make their own decisions by neglecting decisions that would be made for the best interests of the colony, but it was all for the part of, hey, as long as you're making money for us and you're sending us those raw materials, you can do whatever you want. You can trade with France, you can trade with Spain, you can hire privateers to attack Spanish and French ships for all I care. But that was the idea of salutary neglect, was allowing the colonies to a little flexibility in order for them to benefit the mother country, England. And not only that, but there will be a lot of colonies that decide, hey, we should probably question some of the authority and the decisions made at Great Britain. And these, in one particular case, with John Zinger, would be put on trial for his publication of criticizing the royal governor in his newspaper. He would actually be found innocent because he was just speaking his mind. So this was the idea of that freedom of speech that would come later on, the freedom of the press. Some pictures of the Magna Carta signing back in 1215, but that's way early history compared to what we're talking about. And you guys can pause this when you need to capture this, but those three big English traditional political beliefs that would shape our American colonial ways of what government should look like. And as you guys are following along, but here's the things you should be taking down in your notes. And then this last section right here, how did these traditions form American ideas of government? You can talk about it in your own writing, like how do these three things help shape our American way of life? What were some of those things in there? Like Magna Carta, written agreement of government, parliament, a representative style body of government, an English Bill of Rights, that idea of writing out the rights of the people. So in this map here, one example of how Great Britain would try to put their dominance into the colonies, but ultimately would fail, is with the dominion of New England. There was a point when Great Britain decided, you know what, in 1686, we're going to try and make all these northern colonies, because they're so small, we're going to make them into one giant super colony. But it never succeeded. And it was because of the lack of support from the colonial assemblies who were in Massachusetts and in Rhode Island, Connecticut. So this would eventually prove that Great Britain didn't really have full power over the colonies after all. And not only that, but you still have the ideas of the Enlightenment who are reaching to everybody in the colonies with writings and with the publication of different books. And it's going to be widespread across the colonies, thinking that, hey, this idea of self-government is a great idea, and we're doing it already with their colonial assemblies. You also have some very famous figures, especially one like Dr. Benjamin Franklin, who's going to be an example of an enlightened man. Not only is he going to write a lot of publications like his almanac and different patents for different inventions like the bifocal glasses and the Lightning rod, he's also going to be a big advocate for the Pennsylvania colony government or colonial government. And even in the middle colonies, there's going to be an outcry for a noose for people who want to seek freedom of worship as an individual right. This is going to come through the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is a period in the 1700s, especially in the New England and middle colonies, where sermons and preachers would preach about what it's like for people of different backgrounds and different beliefs to openly share their beliefs. You can no longer just hide it because you're going to be persecuted or be put to death. You should be embracing the diversity. So in the Great Awakening, preachers will travel across many towns and touch many listeners. And this is going to seek that idea that religious freedom is a right. It's not just something that you can just be received on special privilege. It is a right. And that's something that we still struggle with today in some instances. However, it's something that we will see as we established the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Some of the big important figures of the Great Awakening, they include Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, primarily who's preached in the New England territory, going into New York and to the middle colonies, not very much reaching into Pennsylvania, because many of the colonists there were Quakers and they were set in their beliefs, but the Quakers would still accept these ideas of religious toleration and religious freedom for anybody living in the colonies. And in the southern colonies, it was very strict for religious freedom, but they would still adopt the idea that, yes, people should have that right of religious freedom. And if you're not a member of the Anglican Church, for example, then you're exempt from your other rights. No, they wanted to make sure that it was given to everybody. A picture of Jonathan Edwards. So now let's talk about some of the events that really disdained the relationship between the colonists and New England, Great Britain. So let's talk about the Bacon Rebellion. Not bacon as in the crispy bacon we love to make in the morning, but a man by the name of Nathaniel Bacon. So he was a farmer living out in Virginia, and at this point, there was still tensions between Native American groups in Virginia and the settlers. But the royal governor, John Berkeley, decided that he wanted to order the colonists to stop encroaching upon the Native American lands because there is a divided territory, settlers on one side and Native Americans on the other. Nathaniel Bacon was enraged by this because, like, how dare they take away my right to take land as I see fit? So he establishes a small army of colonists. He marches his army straight into Jamestown and burns it to the ground, chasing out Berkeley. However, after a few months of holding the town, Berkeley dies of disease, and the rebellion ultimately fails. But it showed that the colonists could successfully rise up against royal governors and royal officials and seek what they wanted. And this is something that we're going to see later on in the American Revolution, just saying. So, and it's also going to bring a lot of colonists to start thinking like, maybe we're better off by ourselves than instead of just people from Great Britain trying to make decisions for us, because royal governors, they weren't native to the colonies. Royal governors were appointed by the king and came to the colonies, and it was kind of a loathsome appointment because, like, I have a great life in England. Why should I go over to the American colonies? And you would see that the governor's palace would be such a lavish and glorious setting while everybody else is living in some modern housing. But yeah, the royal governors, they really separated themselves from the colonists because they were still Englishmen at the end of the day. They were just appointed like it would be if I were to go on deployment or something. So with that being said, again, a picture of Berkeley being kicked out by Nathaniel Bacon and his goons. So now, same thing with trade. There's going to be a lot of tensions being made against Great Britain and the colonies about who really owns this trade. Remember that the idea of mercantilism is bringing all the colonial goods to the mother country. However, as colonies start to govern themselves, there becomes this clash of, well, these are our goods. Why can't we establish and make them our own? Why can't we control the trade? So Parliament is going to enact several different acts called the Navigation Acts to really enforce how commerce and wealth should be distributed from the colonies back to Great Britain. And this is going to anger a lot of merchants and farmers in the colonies because they want those goods. They don't want to see their products being shipped over to Great Britain just so that Great Britain can get those merchants in Great Britain can get all the money. And again, with the idea of those staple crops and cash crops, as the colonies grow, you'll start to see a growth in the southern colonies of more cash crops being grown like cotton and tobacco, while in the northern colonies, more staple crops like corn and potatoes for food, for nutritional value, are going to be more highly desired in the middle and the northern colonies. A picture of that just to show you guys. And then in our last section of notes here, guys, make sure you're capturing who those famous figures were and the impacts of the Great Awakening, as well as these three events that really shaped colonial resistance to Great Britain's authority. So again, this is all leading up to our next unit, the American Revolution, where we'd start talking about the French and Indian War to the taxations that would be imposed upon the colonies and the resistance movements that would be made primarily in Boston, all the way up to the American Revolutionary War. And with that said, guys, I will see y'all in the next unit that I do on these videos. Out of here.